Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm Jo, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. There is a long and illustrious history of fermentation in Korean cuisine. Different types of fermented food products, including but not limited to doenjang, Kanjang, Gochujang, and Kimchi, are integral and essential to Korean way of eating and cooking. Some may sound very familiar to you even if you didn't grow up eating Korean food, but certain types of Korean fermented food products may sound very novel and different. We are lucky to have Irene Yoo, who will be our guide into the Korean art of fermentation. Irene Yoo is a food writer who has contributed to many publications, and she is also the founder and chef of You Eating, a Korean-American comfort food pop-up that highlights home cooking, street food, and drinking culture of Korea. And if you thought your sourdough starter was good enough for your foodie credentials, wait until you see what she does at her own house. And Irene is joining us from her home. Welcome to the Korea Society, Irene.
Thank you so much for having me.
A quick reminder to our viewers, you can send your questions via Twitter at Korea Society Art or email artsandculture@koreasociety.org. I will come back a little later with your questions, but Irene, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining today. I'm really excited to be talking about fermentation, specifically Korean fermentation. So a little bit about me is I am the chef and founder of You Eating, which initially started as a series of pop-ups for me to explore the Korean food that I grew up with through the lens of other cultural cuisines. So since then, I've written for a bunch of publications, including Food 52, Food Network, and Slate. And I also penned the Meju chapter in Koji Alchemy, which is a book that came out last year about fermentation. And then since then, I've also since launched a YouTube channel through which you can find recipe videos and other food videos centered around Korean American food. So what is fermentation? Fermentation has existed in all cultures for thousands of years. And the original fermentation is alcohol. So you'll have like your wines and your beers, but of course you see it in things like pickles, cheeses, yogurts. But in essence, it's controlling the natural breakdown of food. So it's controlled rot. In Korea, fermentation dates back to the three kingdoms of Korea, which pre-Joseon, and actually probably even a little bit before that. And particularly the long-standing Buddhist history in Korea, which really promotes like a vegetarian diet, also help to bring in foods like kimchi into our cuisine. And that's sort of where you'll see the tradition of burying vegetables in large pots called Bonkis into the ground as well. So why fermentation? Fermentation stems from a place of necessity. It's basically needing to preserve foods during a time when you may not have it, like through the winter. And specifically, if you don't have easy access to refrigeration, which is obviously something we all do today. And also, the fermentation changes the flavor of our foods. So the bacteria and yeast and microbes that are in foods and in the air will help to amplify either existing flavors or create deeper, richer flavors in those foods. And then, of course, as many Koreans love to tell you, that it's all about, it's good for you. It's all about gut health. It helps to help you digest foods better, and then also support your body with good bacteria. So the three types of fermentation, Korean fermentation I'm gonna be focusing on today are jang, Chaka, and kimchi. And I'm gonna explain what those are as I go. Fermentation is really something that pervades through all aspects of Korean cuisine. And according to the Museum of Kimchi in Korea, there's a specific reason for that. And that's because of these things called butumak, which are the big Korean, like heavy cast iron cauldrons that would be in the kitchens and sort of the, the hearth of our homes or these traditional Korean homes. But since those cauldrons couldn't get super hot and then also stayed warm for a really long time, a lot of our foods have since become reliant on either like low heat cooking. So you'll have your like soups or jigaes, and then also fermented foods, which tends to keep and develop really well in warm places. So that's something you'll also see as a thorough line in this presentation. And that's really what differentiates Korean food from Chinese food, which tends to be a lot of food that's cooked at a high heat, for example, wok cooking. And then also Japanese food, which features a lot of more like raw presentations and preparations. And keeping in mind that this is a pretty general overview, there's so many different types of jangs, chakas, kimchis, other fermentations, but I'm just gonna sort of cover it from a high level today. All right, but before I can talk about any of those, I have to talk about Meju. Meju is really the building block of Korean fermentation. All it really is soybeans that are cooked and then shaped into a brick. And then those are either dried on ondol floors, which are the like the warmed floors in Korean houses, or out in the sun. And the reason for that is because it naturally grows Aspergillus oryzae. They're tied up with these rice husks. Aspergillus oryzae is also known as koji, which is something that many of you may have heard through both in the book that I mentioned earlier, and then also in a lot of Japanese fermentation. But it's unique because it's also naturally inoculated with Bacillus subtilis, which is just a wild bacteria that floats around in the air. So once you've properly fermented Meju, you then put those into a saltwater brine in an ongi, which is a Korean, which are like these Korean clay jars, which I'll show you later. And then that's immersed in a salt brine along with charcoal and red chilies, which sort of it's a little bit of a like scientific thing for purity and sterilization, but also a little bit tied to like Korean shamanistic culture and just sort of like blessing let us have good Pinjang. And then that's fermented for another 3 to 6 months. And then once you strain that, the solids are what's known as Pinjang. That is usually salted and then fermented even more. So now, what's the difference between Pinjang and Miso? They're both fermented soybean paste. For Korean Pinjang, that's naturally inoculated, as I mentioned, with the bacteria that's in the air, and it's a little bit more of a wild fermentation. And so it really comes from a place of home cooking in our Korean culture. Whereas miso is specifically cooked soybeans that is directly mixed with koji, which are rice grains that are inoculated with Aspergillus oryzae. And so that's more of a controlled fermentation and much more like reproducible in lab or commercial settings. And then otherwise it's made in a pretty similar way, but the liquid runoff for miso is not Japanese soy sauce. That's actually called tamari. So a lot of people who are gluten-free, and this is something I learned from a friend of mine, which is that he's like, I can't eat soy sauce because it has gluten in it. And that's because he can have tamari, which is gluten-free. And I'll explain why later, why soy sauce has gluten in it. All right, Pinjang is used in a ton of Korean cooking. It is, so for example, here I have doenjang jjigae, which is the classic Pinjang dish for me. And then it also pairs really well with pork and pork belly because it helps to sort of mitigate the gaminess that can come from cooking pork. And then it's almost always mixed and cooked into a broth or a liquid. But I also kind of like to use in like a vegetable panchan. So for example, here I have there's like a muchim, cabbage muchim that you can do with it. All right, so kanjang. Kanjang is soy sauce. In Korean fermentation, soy sauce, kanjang, and pinjang go hand in hand because they're produced at the same time. So again, the meju is put into a salt brine and that's fermented. And then when you strain it, the liquid you have left over is kanjang. But specifically, that's ganjang. It's also known as 집 간장 or house kanjang or chosan ganjang. So I know I've gone to like the Korean grocery store and seen this like whole big aisle of Korean soy sauces and just been totally overwhelmed with what to buy, what all the different varieties are. But what I learned is that almost none of it is this traditional Korean kanjang. So let me parse out those differences. You have ganjang, which I just explained, and WeiKanjang. WeiKanjang is Japanese soy sauce. So WeiKanjang is made with wheat, soybeans, and koji. And it's made in a process, it's become commercialized. It's made in a process that requires a lot of agitation and mixing. It's very labor heavy because basically after brewing and mixing and fermenting, you have to squeeze that through like giant sheets of cotton. It's also, the flavor is a little bit sweeter because of the wheat. And it's usually used in things like stir fries, braising, marinating, dipping. It's more of the soy sauce flavor that you're familiar with. Whereas ganjang tends to be saltier and it's less sort of commercially produced because it is something that was traditionally made in homes of Korean people. And the thing with ganjang too is that when it's first made and fermented, the smell and the taste is much more pungent and more akin to fish sauce. And then after 3-5 more years, then it turns into a more like smoother, like umami rich flavor. In Korean cooking, that has been used more for soups, hence why it's called ganjang. And then also namus and muchims and just things that you sort of generally associate with more like traditional Korean cuisines. So why is it the case that the kanjang we're seeing in the store is more of this WeiKanjang than this ganjang? So that's because before and during the Japanese occupation, Japanese soy sauce brewing methods were implemented into Korea. So Japan had long since commercialized soy sauce, and they were building commercial breweries in Korea, mostly in areas where there were a lot of Japanese populations. After the occupation, and then throughout the Korean War and after that, those factories were then given to the Korean managers who have since developed them into companies you probably recognize today, like Sempyo or Made. And also, it sort of took over as a predominant pantry staple because during wartime and occupation, a lot of people had to flee their homes. So any changs that they had at home, they had to leave behind. And then also just generally with modernization, people, have smaller spaces and in giving up space in lieu of convenience, then you start to lack areas to be able to make your own Meju, make your own changs and whatnot. So as essentially commercial soy sauce got cheaper and more prevalent, it became much more convenient for Koreans to buy that. All right, so the different types of commercial kanjang. So as I mentioned, almost none of the supermarket kanjangs are the ganjang, except for one brand that I can find easily in my like local American Korean grocery store, which is this chosan ganjang. So this is made in a traditional ganjang style. From there, the categories tend to get a little bit hazier. You have yangjo ganjang, which is naturally brewed soy sauce. It's brewed in that in that originally Japanese way with wheat. And then you have jinganjang. Jinganjang used to mean aged soy sauce or dark soy sauce. And it was essentially your ganjang after you had aged it for 3, 5, 10 more years. It would start to get darker and more like that classic soy sauce flavor. But in stores today, that's really become a little bit more of a free-for-all. Some brands, it is still like the naturally brewed. In other brands, you tend to start to get a little bit more mix of like chemically brewed soy sauces. And then also you have ganjang, which means flavored kanjang. And that is when you take soy sauce and you start to cook it or mix it in with different flavoring agents like garlic, onion, fruits, etc. And that's really sort of marketed more towards like a culinary, from a culinary and cooking perspective. So I guess if you're going to go out and try and WeiKanjang now, learning what you've learned today, in general, you want to look for higher TN numbers, which stands for the amount of nitrogen produced in a soy sauce just as a byproduct of fermentation of soybeans. You don't have to remember that, just remember TN, higher numbers. And then also avoid acid hydrolyzed soy sauce, because that is a bit more of that like chemically processed or like cheaper soy sauce. And I'm using quotations a lot because like, it really comes down to like your taste preferences. And I'm not trying to say that like one is better than the other. I'm just explaining like the history and, where it's all coming from. All right. So Kanjang, Pinjang, and then lastly, we have Gochujang. So Gochujang is fermented red pepper paste. It is, however, not made in the same way that Pinjang is. So instead, we have Meju, which is ground into a powder. And that Meju powder is mixed with gochujang, which is red chili powder, and then glutinous rice flour, but also can be used with other rice flours, and then more barley, which helps with the fermentation, and salts. So this one is actually a really easy one to make at home because you can buy all the ingredients at your local supermarket, as I will show you later, and mix it and then put it in a jar. And then like 3 months later, you will have your own gochujang. And gochujang is used in a ton of dishes to impart both spiciness and richness, and particularly in things like here I have tteokbokki, and then also 닭갈비, the classic 부대찌개 or army stew, and then also different stir fries, like here's octopus stir fry or 오징어 볶음. Gochujang almost always needs to be, like with all the other changs, needs to be mixed with liquid and cooked. And usually when you cook with gochujang, the heat can be offset with a little bit of sugar or sweeteners. And again, getting into more of that like modern Korean flavor profile today. And also like, I feel like we can use gochujang in anything. Like this week, we used it in meatloaf and it was amazing. So as I mentioned, those are sort of the main changs. There are so many different types of changs that like, if you start pulling this thread, it just unravels in amazing varieties. The chang that I also asked about most, other than the top three, is Samjang. Samjang is a dipping paste that's made with doenjang and gochujang. You'll definitely have seen it at Korean barbecue places, but that's not its own fermented product. It's made with fermented products, but not fermented on its own or additionally. You also have cheonggukjang, which is similar to Japanese natto, and it's similar to doenjang in that it is also fermented soybeans, but it's fermented in a much faster way. It is extremely pungent and almost, I think, exclusively used in cheonggukjang jjigae, which is a stew that's made with cheonggukjang. And then lastly, I've listed here Samjang, which is one of many different types of sort of unique innovations of changs apart from just doenjang. And that means essentially that as with a lot of fermentation, you can sort of just mix and match things you have available to you to create different flavors. So Samjang specifically is a form of doenjang that's made with barley and ground pepper seeds. So it sort of has that like spiciness that you like in gochujang, but then also has a little bit of like sweetness, but earthiness from barley. And then the different varieties can go from there. I've heard of like strawberry gochujang or like other types of doenjangs or like fermented soybean paste that incorporate other flavors. So moving on from changs, we have Chaka. So one of my favorite things to do is to go to these like Korean markets, and they have the ajumas who's selling just ginormous tubs of Chaka. And I always wonder, how on earth does she sell all of this? But Chaka is essentially salted and preserved fish or shellfish. In Korea, this tends to be focused on sort of small catch or fish innards, like things that are like small and plentiful and really lend themselves into creating this like rich umami flavor bomb. And then these can also be loosely broken down into three main categories. You have chokka, which literally means chopsticks, and those can be eaten as banchan. And then you have chot, which I sort of colloquially just think about as like smaller chokka. So you're like seuja is the classic jot. Those tend to be used for like condiments or dipping. And then you also have ekjot, which is liquid chokka, and that's essentially fish sauce. So those are used for seasoning kimchi or soups and stews. So chokka is one of those things you definitely go to the Korean supermarket and you see all of these little classic plastic tubs of banchan. So going clockwise, I guess, you have seuja or salted shrimp. This is very commonly used in kimchi. And then you have myeonanja, which is salted pollock roe, also known as mantaiko in Japanese. And then on the bottom, we have gaejang, or specifically Kanjang gaejang, which is salted or marinated crab. And then you have doenjang chokka, which is salted squid, but there's so many versions of this sort of thing too, where you have like salted squid, salted calamari, octopus, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and then last section, the meat of it, or classic Korean banner food, is kimchi. Kimchi is simply salted and fermented vegetables and or fruit. There's a lot of different vegetables that can be kimchied, and essentially it's essentially just anything that has like a higher water content. You always salt it to draw out the water and start the fermentation process. And then you add in additional seasonings, and that helps to create more flavor and then extend the preservation and shelf life of it. So what specifically sets kimchi apart from other cultural cuisines is pickles, essentially, is that kimchi is really meant to be consumed both vegetable and brine. So if you have like your classic dill pickle, you're really not like, I mean, I guess you could kind of take shots of dill pickle juice, but you're not like going out there trying to eat the brine or consume the brine straight. Whereas with kimchi, they really do go hand in hand. So I could talk about kimchi for a whole different presentation, but I'm really going to frame this in two ways. So one will be by explaining the different types of kimchis through history and how they've been introduced into Korean cuisine through history. And then also in terms of aging of kimchi. So in like the 5th and 6th century, again, going back to pre-Joseon Three Kingdoms era, you have janji and changaji. So janji is essentially just salted vegetables, no water. And then changaji is more of your traditional pickle type of thing. So then this whole category is essentially, which all of these which still exist today, is just preserving vegetables in salt water, soy sauce, or even lees, which is the fermented byproduct of alcohol making, like makgeolli. Oh, and then I should mention that I did not cover makgeolli in this presentation, because again, that's a whole different, alcohol is a whole nother fermentation presentation. So from there, we have just simply salting veggies. we're now moving into developing that classic kimchi, developing kimchi as its own type of pickle, in that we have mulgimchi or water kimchi, and then also yangnyeom kimchi. So the mulgimchi is then created specifically that you can consume the brine that usually radishes are brined in along with the vegetable itself. And then yangnyeom kimchi, which means sort of like seasoned kimchi. And that's when you start to see other flavoring agents be introduced. So, then again, like your garlic, ginger, etc. From there, we inch a little closer with seokbakji. So this is a photo of modern seokbakji, because I could not find a photo of pre-modern seokbakji. And that's important to note, because red chilies were not introduced into Korean culture until after this time. This is when you start to see the introduction of Chaka, or the salted and fermented fish or fish parts, into vegetable fermentation or vegetable pickling. So we're, again, continuing to add on to what we know as the classic kimchi recipe. Start with your salt, and then you start to add water, you start to add seasonings, you start to add like cha or chaka. And now we've arrived at our classic Korean kimchi. And this sort of got introduced around the 17th, 18th century. It was right in the middle of the Joseon dynasty. But there was actually red kimchis that existed prior to chili peppers, and that was dyed red using flowers. And then in the 19th century, the use of chilies became much more incorporated and widespread. And now we've moved on from just pickling different vegetables, or specifically radish, into the whole cabbage kimchi, which is what we're familiar with today. So there's a spectrum of kimchi fermentation. I always like to tell people that if you go to the grocery store and you buy kimchi, it's almost always under fermented, because they need to have it out on the shelf for a long time until you buy it. And that when you bring it home and you eat it, it's not going to taste the way that it does at like your Korean restaurant, or maybe the way your mom made it. And the reason for that is because there's different stages of fermentation. Obviously, so essentially kimchi is made at like during the fall harvest, when all the cabbages are ready, and then they're in households like made in a way that you can eat them through their different stages of fermentation. So the earliest form of this fermentation is 겉절이. So this is super fresh, super pungent kimchi. Since it's meant to be eaten immediately, you really amp up the flavor and like the funkiness of it. And this pairs really well with like 보쌈 and makgeolli, and it sort of retains a lot of its crunchiness. And then on the flip side, you have Mugenji. So this is when your kimchi has become so old. It's like when you open the kimchi jar and it's like starts to fizz. And it's definitely like that smell when you're like, oh, it's maybe a little past due. But you should never throw this Mugenji away. This is just all hard-earned flavor. This should almost always be cooked. There's a lot of Mugenji jigaes or kamjatang, or things that incorporate this like beautifully aged kimchi. Or also you can wrap it meat in it or fish in it and create different jims or braises. So kimchi dishes. Kimchi is obviously made to be served as a banchan at your table alongside your rice and all of your other banchans or stews, but it can obviously be incorporated into specific dishes. So you have your kimchi jjigae, kimchi fried rice, dongchimi-guksu, which is the noodle dish pictured here, is specifically a water radish kimchi that you put noodles in. So again, you're drinking the water and also consuming the kimchi vegetable at the same time. And then also tubu kimchi, which is a way that you can eat that gatjari that I mentioned earlier, that really fresh kimchi gets balanced by sort of the mellowness of tubu. So that is it for my presentation. I will show my tongues at this point in time and stop sharing my screen. Okay. So, and then also, Jay, if you want to start asking questions, you can as well. So I'm going to start with my doenjang, which is currently decanted into a smaller jar. I have to constantly be moving chans into smaller and smaller jars as they reduce in liquid size. So this is the doenjang. There is a little bit of white molds forming on the top. So this I made Meju in January of 2019. And then back here, I have the Kanjang. But let me talk a little bit about these ongis actually. So ongis are these traditional Korean fermentation pots. And the reason they're special is because the type of clay that is used is kind of porous. It allows air and then obviously good bacteria to flow in, but while keeping everything inside. So it allows a lot of good airflow. And then generally these are put outside of the home. So I usually keep mine right outside on my balcony in order to help that fermentation. And then you also want to put them in the sun because the sunlight helps to both sterilize and sort of move that fermentation process along. So this is my Pinjang. It's very stinky. And then I have my Ganjang here, but I decanted it a little bit into a smaller glass so you can see. So this is also very smelly. It smells a lot like the doenjang with like that really deep fermented soybean flavor. And then as this ages, it'll get darker and also that like pungency will mellow out. And then lastly, I have my gochujang, which now, yeah, it used to be much larger, but I have since given away lots of gochujang to all my friends, so there's not very much left in it. Parse this out. I don't think you can see inside, but no. Oh,
nope.
Sort of.
Almost. Yep. There you go.
But I will scoop a little bit out to see. So
yeah,
this is the gochujang. Oh my God, I'm going to drop it on my laptop. So yeah, I made this in March of 2019. I did mess up because I accidentally used coarse gochugaru instead of fine gochugaru, which is fine. Like it's still tasty and it still worked. It's just not like a gochujang that I want to eat straight. Not that I would be doing that anyways, but it sort of tends to need to be like cooked into things. But it has such a good smell right now. And this I would highly recommend everyone go and make for themselves because this was a fun process.
I'm sure everybody will want to after watching your presentation, or at least they'll probably run out and try to get some Korean food tonight. So I wanted to, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, I feel like, as a Korean, you feel like you know all about all these things, but then there are so many things that I just heard and you just go like, oh, that kind of makes sense. I never thought of it that way. But let me start asking you a little bit about, one of the things that's really hard to do on this medium is as you mentioned, the smell. When I told my friends that we're doing this program, there's so many Korean Americans who are saying, oh, I remember when my mom used to make, doenjang or gochujang, and that smell that came from the basement. And I think actually a lot of Korean Americans have more memory of that because, in the 60s and 70s, there weren't that many Korean food products available in the United States as they are now. So there are, so the people who grew up in that era has more memories of homemade gochujang and doenjang and kimchi, even more so than probably Koreans. So how did you get interested in making all these products on your own at your home?
Yeah, so I've always been a little bit curious, like with a lot of Korean Americans who grew up in America, Pinjang and Kanjang and Gochujang are just things that like show up. And then you have to learn to buy them. And then like literally I would go to the store and be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to buy. And or where it comes from, or like what the process of making it is. My mom did not make neither my mom nor any of my grandmas made gochujang or doenjang or their own chang. So I really sort of had to do a little bit of discovery on my own. I have a friend, Chef John, who co-wrote the Meju chapter in Koji Alchemy with me, who is just he just loves to ferment things and he has no fear about it. So that was really inspiring to me to be like, oh, you're just taking this thing and salt and you're putting in a jar and then we will drink alcohol in 2 weeks. Okay. And being really inspired by that to sort of have my own fermentation journey and do the research. I will say that I made the Meju and my husband after a week was like, you must remove the Meju from the house. And I was like, no. I kept one just because I wanted to monitor it. And the other two I took to the Museum of Food and Drink where actually that's where I know the Chef John from. And then they also were like, okay, please remove this stinky brick from our place.
They are pungent. I mean, I think it's hard to describe what they smell like, other than to say it's really strong and it's really pungent. And once you've smelled it, I don't think anybody can forget what that smells like. So there's somebody who was asking about Meju, actually. So you talked about this, what seemed like a very simple process, but also it's like almost like each process is very scientifically, there's a reason behind why you use it. So for example, the rice straws, I wouldn't think that you'll be able to find rice straws in Manhattan or Brooklyn these days. So some people are asking, what are your sort of alternatives if you can't really get those very traditional, starting with the beans. Can you make Pinjang out of, any of the, beans that are readily available? And then what do you do in terms of the straws? And the biggest question actually we're getting is what happens if you can't get this very specific type of ongi or hangari that is porous, as you mentioned? Then what are the alternatives for people?
Definitely. So Meju is made with Meju Kong, which is really just dried soybeans. So those you can pretty much get anywhere. From there, it's pretty simply just cooking them and then drying them into the brick shape. So that part was super easy. Sourcing rice straws was near impossible. I literally called my friend who has like a makgeolli brewery. I called people in other states. I was like, because I just wanted to try and do it with the rice straws. To be honest, like my friend suggested literally inoculating with koji, which is sort of introduces that same bacteria. And again, to be honest, like a large part of the bacteria in fermentation does come from just what's naturally in the air. That is really interesting because it means that depending on your space and who's in it, what's floating around in the air, that can affect the fermentation of it. Rice straw, like, if you know somebody, if you live in a place where like, you have, maybe you're like literally driving down the highway and you see like a rice paddy or rice field, you can get them there. Or if you, I don't know, to have connections. I will say like what I ended up doing was going to the hardware store and buying hay, because that was as close to rice straw as I could get. I had to buy a bale of hay this big to use this much.
And then what about the vessels themselves? What would you use if you can't get the traditional Korean vessels?
Right. So you certainly don't need to use ongis or hangaris to make any of these things, you can put it into any sort of ceramic jar or glass jar or anything. You want it to be something where it's you don't close the lid 100%, because as it ferments, or just like as air flows, then you have a little bit of risk of explosion. So that is what's nice about like the hangaris, is that it's like air locked, so you can go out, but nothing can go in. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, maybe it's just like a plate that you put on top of a glass jar. And I would also suggest that it be something that, especially with like gochujang, that you don't want to use again or use for any other thing, because that it's a smell that it's very difficult to get out. And using these pots too, is they're not really meant to be like washed with soap and water, and the sterilization process involves sort of smoking it out with charcoal in order to just kill the bad bacteria, but keep any good bacteria. The more you make it, ideally, the bacteria that already exists in it from previous batches will help to ferment future ones.
Yeah, that whole using of charcoals and chilies, perhaps for the whole antibacterial qualities in them, it reminded me of the stories like in Korea, you know, in the old days, you would hang this rope, you know, sort of the, you know, hay rope, or, you know, and then you would insert charcoals, and sometimes, and that was your announcing to the village that there's a baby. That was sort of and one of the theory is that it's because charcoal wards off infections, but also it's just their way of saying like, do not come in because there's a baby and a, you know, new mother, and they need to be protected. And then they would put chili peppers in there if there was a boy, if it was a boy. But then let's talk a little bit about also, like I noticed that when you showed us the gochujang vessel, there were two things. One is that you had like a cloth over it, which you didn't. Is that another way of sort of adding another layer? And do you do that for doenjang too, or is that just specifically for gochujang?
No, this was, so basically what you want to do when you're making it is, again, if you have it outside and on a sunny day, you want to be able to take the lid off to allow the sun to get in and hit them. So this is like a more analog method. I will also show you, someone asked me this earlier today too. They make these things. So these go on the top of the hangaris, so that you can like just keep them like this.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so you'll see that there's it's mesh on the side to again allow airflow, but then it's all glass on the top so that sun can come directly on it.
Oh, so it's trying to get the sun to actually hit the. Got it. Got it. I wanted to ask you about this idea of making your own food. Is that something? Do you find in Korea as well? You know, we hear all these stories about how industrialized Korea is these days, and nobody's making kimchi anymore. So however, there must be some people who are very much interested in making things traditional way. Did you have any chance to talk to people in Korea what sort of the scene is like in terms of like artisanal? You know, I guess now, you know, instead of the industrialized food production versus sort of the artisanal ones, are there young people making their own Meju and Pinjang, or trying to learn the sort of the way of doing things?
Well, I do think that in Korea, it's become so hyper modernized that, and convenience is a huge factor, and just the sheer number of, in places like Seoul, especially the sheer number of people in a small space makes it just really impossible to be able to make your own foods. And why make your own kimchi when it's just as easy to get really good kimchi at your local 7-Eleven in like a small individual portion size. And also the commercialization of all these different changs has just also, I think, changed a little bit of the taste preferences of Korean people, that they're used to the flavors of like the supermarket ganjang, and that when they try, and I said Koreans and Korean Americans alike, and then they try like ganjang that's made by a small producer, they're very surprised. Oh, I didn't know this was what it's supposed to taste like. From my experience, I think a lot of Korean Americans have renewed interest in it, sort of in the same way that a lot of people, like you could easily buy sourdough bread at your local bakery, but like people just are interested in trying it at home and playing around with it. And so in the same way, people are interested in either making it at home or finding small purveyors. And so there is a few different like purveyors that are local to me here in New York, like Gotham Grove and Kimchi Market, who are making these connections to small producers and makers in Korea and importing that into America, both to share like our culture and history with our people, and then with just people outside of it who are interested in Korean food. So I actually even have like a few here that I can show you. Yeah. Is Gotham Grove. I got these from Gotham Grove. This is a 3-year Kanjang and a 5-year Kanjang. So these are really interesting to me to really give me an idea of like the taste of what Kanjang is meant to be. And even these like Kanjang production or doenjang production in Korea in the traditional way is something that like people have had to work to maintain. And I don't know if like you or other people have heard of just having it be a part of like a cultural institution, or like like they get like a cultural merit order to be like, you are a person who knows all these traditional things. Please don't die. Please pass on your knowledge to other people, because a lot of that art is getting lost.
So then what would be like sort of the best way to show off that taste of, you know, the old-fashioned Kanjang? Like you mentioned, I mean, everybody there, I think, is pretty familiar with, you know, sort of that very strong taste, you know, sort of that spiciness and the sort of very savoriness of Korean cooking. And that's what people love. Everything from Korean barbecue to, you know, all the different jigaes. But I think I agree with you that especially in the restaurants, they are very popular. But if you actually think about home cooking, they're much more muted. And you just mentioned earlier about using doenjang to sort of dress vegetables and things like that. What do you think is like sort of the way to play with these ingredients that may not be very familiar to people, and sort of showcase their flavor?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that people just go out and try different like traditional kanjangs or purveyors and makers, because what's interesting about them is that the way they make it is so unique, and that you'll have different types of kanjang or doenjang from different purveyors or different makers. And it's almost like cheese, where like there's hundreds of cheeses and you can spend a year just going through all the different cheeses and learning, what do you like, what do you not like. And what's great about it is it's sort of a whole flavor package within itself. So you can do something so simple as just like simply dress some steamed greens, or use it very simply to flavor a soup without having to sort of do all this extra work of introducing flavor. In the fermentation process, it creates, especially in Korean fermentation, introduces so much natural MSG that alone is just flavor.
And somebody actually just asked a very interesting question. I think we're going to move into the kimchi territory a little, because I think some people are much more, making kimchi seems more accessible than, say, working with gochujang or doenjang. But I think it's all probably based on personal taste too. But especially, I think with, you know, what is really known to many people, the pechu kimchi, the cabbage, napa cabbage kimchi. A lot of people say they have hard time figuring out exactly how you would salt the cabbage. And from my own experience, I can tell you when I first started it, that was really difficult because you really need the salting to happen in order to make good kimchi. So do you have any tips for the novices how to figure out how to salt the cabbage properly?
Yeah, definitely. Agreed. It's half the 3/4 of the battle is just salting your kimchi properly or your cabbage properly in advance. I like to do pretty whole kimchi where I'll either break it into half or quarters, and then I will salt all over in each leaf, put the whole thing into a super salty water brine. And the way I like to test it is that I have to keep trying like the brine. And if I'm not making like this face when I'm tasting it, it's not salty enough.
So it has to be really, really salty, basically.
It has to be like saltier than the sea, like so salty, it hurts to eat it. And then from there, it's also about making sure that you brine it for long enough. And the easy way for you to tell that is when you pick up the cabbage, the leaves will start to bend the other way. So if you have a cabbage like this, it'll start to bend this way. You'll see that water moisture is lost, and just like my mom always likes to do where she like bends it. And if it's like flexible, then you're good to go.
Oh, that's good to know. And then I think a lot of people are very much familiar with the red kimchis, but as you just mentioned, there are so many different types of kimchi. Um, any sort of the kimchi that people may not be familiar with that you want to recommend people to try? Because I think a lot of the non-Koreans, when they think of kimchi, they think of the red cabbages, basically.
Yeah, I think that if you like kimchi because you like the crunchiness of it, then any sort of radish kimchi is a obvious next step. So you'll have like your chonggak kimchi, which are ponytail kimchi. They're very cute because they're just like little adorable radishes with little long greens on the end, which is why they're called ponytail radishes, or kakdugi, which is radish cubes. And then I think what's really fun about kimchi is that you really can kimchi anything. So I have a few dishes that I've created where it incorporates pineapple kimchi. So I will literally get the canned pineapple and then I will kimchi that. And then that like either cooked or like straight develops a lot of like really cool, interesting flavors.
So you brought up this idea I find it very interesting because nowadays I feel like you can't open a cookbook, whether it's written by Korean Americans or whoever, and it's almost impossible not to find a kimchi recipe. It seems definitely to be very fashionable and everybody loves it, which is great. But what do you think, what does it mean to kimchify something? Especially if you are using something like pineapple instead of like versus pickling. I think you kind of mentioned that, actually you are consuming the brine and that's sort of the basic definition of it. But what do you think, what makes something a kimchi? I guess that's my question.
Right. So for me, kimchi is you salt something and then after you remove the water content, then you add additional seasoning or fermentation in it. So I mentioned a lot of this different trademarks in the recipe, which is you'll either have your salted cha or chaka. You'll definitely have it be salted in the beginning, and it incorporates some sort of like brine or paste. And that is what makes it a kimchi versus it being a pickle, which tends to just be, let's say, like a salt water brine or a salt and sugar brine, in order to get both like fermentation and sweetness. That like that fermentation versus the lacto acid fermentation you get from pickles, I think is what differentiates kimchi from classic pickles.
Right. But then because I know there are a lot of recipes out there for vegan kimchis, which I would imagine that you're not using 젓갈 because they are not vegan. So then, is there any other way to, when you're not using certain, type of products, is there a way to help that fermentation process too, or?
That's when the salting in advance plays like a really big role. So that's what's interesting about kimchi recipes is you can really, like some kimchi recipes I've seen or heard of are like 30 ingredients, and then some are like 5. And then when you have more ingredients, it adds all these different opportunities for either flavor development or fermentation development. And then with fewer ingredients, then it starts to become more important in terms of like how you're preparing each step. And then at which point you're, let's say, removing your veggies from like the salt brine and moving on to the seasoning stage, or like, the levels of which you're adding your seasoning or your salt things. Because then in lieu of, if for like vegan kimchis, in lieu of salted chakas, you have to add additional salt or other, like either like red chilies or other types of flavoring agents. Garlic and ginger are also like really helpful for increasing fermentation and staving off spoilage. So yeah.
So I think you've made a lot of people a convert, and a lot of people wants to try make their own gochujang. So they are all, I guess, asking for the recipe again. I just want to tell our viewers that you can watch this program again once the live webcast is over. But do you want to just quickly go through the steps just one more time for everybody? And also, any books you would recommend for people who are interested in making their own doenjang and gochujang?
Sure. So I definitely, like for gochujang, I definitely started around a recipe that Mugenji has published. So I would definitely go to her website and check it out. From there, you can, I like adjusted just to my taste preferences. So very simply, it was getting malt. A lot of it is just sourcing the ingredients. So you have to get malt barley flour, and then you have to like buddha that into water, and basically you're what's it called? You're
soaking it
dissolving,
and then
dissolving it into water. And then that gets mixed with Meju powder, which is the key ingredient, and gochugaru, the fine version, not the coarse version, which is what I did wrong. And then that's also often mixed with brown rice syrup or another type of sweetener. You can just use sugar, or let's say honey, and then also salt. So I don't have a specific recipe for how I did it, because it was a lot of just like, I made it a little less sweet than Mugenji's recipe because that's my taste preference. And then there are also other resources like the Koji Alchemy book that will give you more specifics about the percentage of salt you want to use in terms of weight or volume. And then, yeah, I also, like, there's a lot of people I think who are taking their own fermentation journeys, and it's been really exciting because I think it's again with the sourdough thing and just pickling, and people are just really interested in like making food for themselves at home and learning more about it. So hopefully, like, some people reach out to me today to being like, I'm starting my own journey, or I just started making my own Meju and I'm about to put it in salt water. So I would definitely love to hear more from how that goes for people. And I would love to like try again and make other ones soon once I like run out of my gochujang and stuff.
Yeah, and I think people will definitely try, and I'm sure we'll can talk more about it, but unfortunately that's all the time we have for now. So thanks again, Irene. We wish you all the best and stay healthy. And special thanks to Peter, our IT director, for making this live webcast a possibility, and to our interns, Gia and Hiju, for getting all the questions and doing email outreach and social media postings. And of course, our thanks to you, our members and viewers. We hope you'll join us again. Check out what's coming up on our website, koreasociety.org, or subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss any other programs. So thank you and good night. And I hope everybody has fun with their own gochujang and doenjang. So thank you, Irene.
Thank you.